We start a new series today. So we spent 6 months almost walking through Joshua, and at the end, it wrapped up with Joshua calling the people to a commitment, a covenant with God, saying, choose you this day who you're going to follow, and they say, we're going to follow God, and he's like, be careful because it's not as easy as you think it's going to be. But they say, no, we're going to follow God, and he said, let your testimony be a witness for you and or against you, as he knew the heart of men, and nothing's really changed today. So then we left off with Joshua dying, being buried, and that's pretty much where Joshua's leaves off, and Judges picks up is at the death of Joshua. Us for a church family, as we walk through Joshua, we wrapped up around February, and we really felt led by the praise team and led by the Spirit to focus in on what's worship. What is focusing in on worshiping fully? And we looked at the how, the why, the what, the where of worship. And it was identified as we get really set up for Judges that if our worship is not full or complete or focused in on the right things, it's easy to get distracted. And that's exactly where Israel found themselves as they continue walking through the promised land. As they had inherited the land, they had taken the land, but they hadn't possessed the land. And that's the big thing. Like, we have been given all of God's inheritance, right? We've been given everything we need for a life of godliness, his divine nature, everything that we need. But there's certain parts of our lives that we haven't stepped into yet to possess that, and so we're left wanting. And so that's where Israel found themselves. They're in the land. There's land that they've taken hold of, but they haven't possessed it fully yet. And now the challenge is, and that was what God challenged Joshua, is he said, look, you're in the land, but you haven't obtained it all. You haven't possessed it all. And that's what Judges is basically looking at now. Israel making that next step of completely possessing the land and taking what God has given them and living out his perfect promise for them. So, Judges 1, starting in verse 1. It says, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up to first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. And Judah said to Simeon his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And likewise, I will go with you and into the territory allotted to you. So Simeon went with him. Now, these are individual names, Judah and Simeon, but it's not really individual people, all right? It's the tribes. And so the people ask God, hey, God, Joshua's dead, and they're looking around, and they're basically saying, who's the next leader? Who's going to go up to take the possession of the land? And Josh, as they call out to the people, they're looking and saying, we don't have a Joshua. We don't see a Joshua being raised up. And we're always looking for that next leader, right? And God says, I'm calling out Judah. Now, we would think, well, that's an individual. No, that's a whole nation of God. He's like, I'm calling Judah to go out. Why? Because Judah is the tribe of Judah, the warring people, the battle men, the lineage of Jesus, right? The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And he's like, I'm going to show you that Judah is going to step into this and be the leader as the tribes go in. So what's Judah go? He looks down at his little brother, the little tribe of Simeon, and he goes, hey, you want to go with me? Which in one way is kind of cool, because he's looking to a littler tribe, and he's saying, come with me and come fight with me. But then the flip side of it is, was Judah thinking, I can't do this by myself? We don't know. But either way, you look at it, there's lessons to be learned. So we got a little map of what these inherited lands, what these allotted lands look like. And you see Judah down in the bottom left. That's a huge land. Why? Because they're a huge tribe. And Simeon was a smaller tribe, but Simeon's land was encompassed in Judah's land, which is kind of cool. So you look at that and say, well, Judah's land, hey, part of your land's our land, and you're going to inherit a center section, so why don't you come with us and come conquer this land together, and then you can circle in on your little portion, and we'll take the rest as God's inherited land. The cool thing is he asked his little brother, his little tribe brother, to come alongside. That they didn't just go do it by themselves. But the flip side of that is God called all of Israel to go possess the land. So in a perfect world, Judah would have looked and said, hey, 11 tribes of Israel, come with us. And let's go possess the land together. And when our land's possessed, we'll move in with you. and we'll go possess your land, and then you can settle, and then we can go possess somebody else's land, and we can settle. And instead of 2 tribes fighting against all these Canaanites, it would have been the 12 tribes. Isn't that what God's design was in the first place? Israel, go take your land, your promised land, drive out all the inhabitants of the Canaanite land, and take possession of your land. Now they find themselves 2 against the Canaanites instead of 12 against the Canaanites. Why? Because they had lost track of what God had originally spoken. It's so easy to drift and go, oh, well, God, who's going to go up for us now? Like, who's going to go do my job now? And God goes, well, let's Judah start. Judah goes, Simeon, go with me. But the perfect world would have been Judah saying to the other tribes, hey, we're a nation, right? And we need to go do this together. But unfortunately, they had been fractured at this point. And they're looking at themselves as little nations, little lands, instead of one big nation, which is what the church does. We look at ourselves as a bunch of little local churches. We forget the power of the big C church. And we may have a project and we say, hey, Simeon, come help with me. Instead of rallying the big C church and saying, hey, big C church, let's bust this out and have God do what only God can do through everybody participating together. So it's a good lesson to start with as we look at God's best for the promised land. Now they've defaulted to about 1/6 of what God had planned for them to go inherit their territory. Tribe by tribe, now they're going to start taking their land instead of the whole nation. Now, another good application for this is in a microcosm, we can't do it by ourselves, right? We can't do this thing called life by ourselves. And that's why small groups are so important. And as we start looking at the big picture of what God was saying for Church of the Beach for 2018, as we're walking through Joshua, we say, God, what is your promised land for Church of the Beach for 2018? And he identified 3 things. 2, we know what he's doing. 1, we're not really sure. But I'll identify the 3 things. And you heard it at the vision report at the end of January, and you may have forgotten by now because we forget, and we need to be reminded of what vision looks like. And so God first said, look, I want Church of the Beach to return to the vision of being a church of small groups. And when Church of the Beach started, we had more people in small groups than were coming on Sunday mornings. That's an awesome thing. And half the people coming to our small groups during the week weren't even from Church of the Beach, which is another awesome thing. Now you say, how did you guys do that? We didn't do that. God did it, but it was awesome when he did it. And it was a season we enjoyed, and we sat back and, man, only God can do that. So now we got to look and say, well, only God can do that again. We can't program that. We can't make that happen. But we can intentionally pray and say, God, we want you to birth small groups across our church family to not just reach into our church family, to reach into our community. You say, what's the goal for 2018? My heart would be that everybody sitting in this room and everybody that's a part of Church of the Beach and everybody that's connected to Church of the Beach in some crazy way through a relationship would all be a part of a small group before the end of the year. Wouldn't that be awesome? Now, the administrator part says, let's do a sign up on the back, but that's not how it's going to work, because that would be man programming something. But we can definitely pray and say, God, you do this. You put it on people's hearts to say, I have no clue how to start a small group, but I got a house, I got an apartment, I got a room, I know where a park is, I know where the beach is. And just start spreading the word to the people that you have relationship with to say, could you come do this with me? Let's see what God does. We'll get to the other one in a little bit. But if you've ever had the feeling there's got to be more to what God's doing than what I get to do on Sunday morning, it's true. Now, what God is doing on Sunday morning is great, but it's like this much of what God wants to do across the whole week that you have. And part of that is the lifestyle of relationship, the lifestyle of living life with people in an intimate way that you know God's in the middle of that, and there's that relationship that you can always go to. That you never say, I got nobody to talk to about this situation, I got to wait till Sunday morning. That you'd have that group right there with you. And you wouldn't have to say much, because they'd be like, I know. Because you're that tight into the relationship that what God is doing. So if you've ever said, there's got to be more than what God's doing on Sunday morning, it's true. It's called Relationships with Church of the Beach Family and our community throughout the week through small groups. And so ask God, please ask God, what that looks like for you. As we continue to say, God, what are you doing with us this season at Church of the Beach? All right, so now Judah's got Simeon. They're going to go war together. And in verse 4 it said, Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They found Adonai-Bezek at Bezek, and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adonai-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table, as I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him into Jerusalem, and he died there. So the first success is, man, the first campaign, Simeon and Judah, they rocked it. Like, they went in and they destroyed 10,000. They captured the king. Seems like everything's grand, everything's perfect, just like God said. Judah, I've given you this land, go in and take it. Judah's like, come on, Simeon, come help me. We're going to go take this land. They took the land, and then they got to the king. And what did God say to do with the kings? Devote the kings to me. Devote the cities to me. Why? Because they were enemies of God. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But God's instructions to the Israelites when they went into the Canaanites was, don't spare the kings. But what did Judah and Simeon do with Adonai-Bezek? They cut off his thumbs, they cut off his big toes. Why? Because that's what that culture did. That's what the Canaanites did to their enemies. That's why Adonai-Bezek said, I've done this to 70 kings, and they've eaten under my table, because you can't do much without big toes and thumbs. And they picked up the scraps under my table as a sign of just humiliation and pride. And Adonai-Bezek said, basically, it's returned on me as I've done to 70 kings. But it shouldn't have been. Because Israel didn't do what God asked them to do. Israel looked around and said, how does the culture work? Oh, Adonai-Bezek, he cuts off big toes and thumbs. If that turns your stomach, just wait. Judges gets crazy. But they adopted the practices of the Canaanites instead of doing exactly what God asked them to do. So now they're not going to go fight as a nation, and now the fighting practices of the tribes is to inherit the fighting practices and the warring practices of the Canaanites. And so that's another gradual decline of obedience. Because God said, I didn't ask you to spare the king and cut off his thumbs and nose and toes and humiliate him. I asked you to devote him to me. Verse 8. Then the men of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. And afterwards the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country and in the Negev and in the lowland. And Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in the Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba. And they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. And from there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. And the name of Debir was formerly Kiriath-Sepher. And Caleb said, whoever attacks Kiriath-Sepher and captured it, I will give him Aksah, my daughter, for a wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, and he gave him Aksah, his daughter, for a wife. And when she came to him, she urged him and asked her father for a field. And she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? And she said, give me a blessing. Since you have set me in the land of Negev, give me also springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And the descendants of Kenite, father of Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of the palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negev, near Arad, and they went and settled with the people. And so Judah goes and fights against Jerusalem. We're going to find out later they didn't completely inhabit it, but they set it on fire. They devoted it like they were supposed to. Then they continued traveling through the country. And they took out the giants of Anak, all right? Now, these were the guys that the 12 spies went into the promised land, and they saw the giants of Anak, and they came back and they said, dude, those guys are so big, we can't take the land. And yet Caleb and Joshua said, no, God said we can take it, we can take it. Now they're taking it. And Caleb's leaving the charge. And you think about that story of Caleb and his daughter and his son-in-law Othniel, right? And we say, that rings a bell, doesn't it? Well, good, because that was a flashback from Joshua. So even though Joshua's dead, now there's a flashback of Judah taking over the land, and one of those flashbacks is the story of Caleb, which is an awesome story. It was a fun message. So if you want to go check that out in Joshua 15, December 17th, we walk through that message and that story that God did. So Caleb's providing for his family, and it says that Moses' father-in-law was provided for. He was a Kenite, and he settled in Judah's land because it was a promise that God said, whoever goes with my nation, whoever goes with my people will be blessed as they are blessed. And so as Moses' father-in-law said, no, I'm not going to go with you. You guys go ahead. And Moses goes, no, I really want you to go with me because I know there's a blessing associated with that. And Jesse relented, and he went with Israel. And now Jesse's whole family, his whole lineage, all the Kenites are going to inherit promised land within the tribe of Judah as God promised the allies of Judah. Verse 17, Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited in Zephath and devoted it to destruction. So the name of the city was called Hormah, and Judah also captured Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country. But he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they have chariots of iron. And Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the 3 sons of Anak. All right. So you've looked at, everything's going successful. Everything's being driven back. Judah's taking the land. They got Simeon. They're starting to take over part of Simeon's land as they move northward. But they get into the land of the hill country. And, it's hard to operate chariots in the hill country, so that went really well. But then they got to the level grounds. And they encountered what the spies had encountered. These guys have chariots of iron. And in the hill country, they couldn't really operate them up in the mountains, so they drove the Canaanites down into the plains. But when they got to the plains, it says they weren't able to drive out the Canaanites because of their use of chariots. Now, what did God say to the Israelites? I will give you all the promised land except where the Canaanites possess chariots? No. He said, I'm going to give you all the promised land. But when they got to the plains and they had chariots, they're like, too much work. We'll leave them here. We got a plan. We'll get to the plan in a little bit, but we got a plan. And God says, no. I said when you get to the land of the Canaanites, I want you to drive out all the Canaanites, even in the plains where they have chariots. But God, we drove out all the mountain people. They're the toughest ones. The plain people, we can work with them. We can negotiate a little bit. But that's not what God said. And so not only are they not fighting as a nation and they're going about it tribe by tribe, now they're not just accepting and practicing the warring principles of the Canaanites. Now they're saying, you know what, it's no big deal. We'll have a plan. We're not going to drive them all out. It's just too much work. And those chariots, they just can't be whipped. So we're going to let them be. That's Judah. The next verse, verse 21, it says, but the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in the Jerusalem to this day. And so Judah sets an example. Benjamin goes, we're getting word that Judah's not going to drive out the chariots in the plains. And you know what? These Jebusites are really giving us a tough time in Jerusalem because they're just holed in. We can't dig them all out. So we're just going to leave them. But we're going to settle in Jerusalem anyway. So at least in Judah, they separated themselves. They said, you know what, we're going to take the hill country. We're going to leave the plains to the Canaanites. We'll deal with them later. Benjamin, however, in Jerusalem says, we're going to live amongst them. Because they're just too hard. We can't get rid of them all. So we're just going to settle into Jerusalem and let them be where they need to be, and we'll work it out later. So they decide to coexist with the Jebusites in Jerusalem. Verse 22, the house of Joseph, that's Ephraim and Manasseh, also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them, and the house of Joseph scattered out Bethel. And now the name of the city was formerly Luz, and the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, please show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you. And he showed them the way into the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and his family go. And the man went in the land of the Hittites and built a city and called it Luz. That's its name to the day. So we got Judah doing its thing. We got Benjamin doing its thing. And then the house of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh go out to fight in Bethel, which was a huge, important city that God wanted to give them. It's where the Lord appeared to Abram in the very first place and said, look, I'm going to give you all this land. It's where the Lord appeared to Jacob, and he had the vision and the dream of the angels ascending and descending on the ladder in Genesis 28. It's where Jacob wrestled with Jesus, and Jesus renamed him. You think God wanted them to inhabit Bethel? Absolutely. But they see a dude walking into the city, and they're like, psst, psst, come here. We need a secret way to get into the city because we're not going to go through the gates because we don't trust God enough to deliver Bethel into our hands. So could you show us the secret route into the city? And the guy's like, sure. I don't give a rip about my people. Are you going to let me go? Oh, yeah, we'll let you go. We'll deal kind with you, and we'll let you do whatever you want to. And so the guy shows them a secret route into the city. They take the city of Bethel, and then they let the dude and his family leave. And the only thing really attributable to the tribe at this point is they kept their word. Unfortunately, they never should have given their word to keep their word. Because God didn't say, go find a dude that lives in the city and find a secret entrance into the city and then take the city of Bethel. He said, go into Bethel and take the city of Bethel. You're like, dude, why are you so hard on these guys? Isn't that what Rahab did? No. Rahab was a God-fearing woman that had heard about our God and said, our people are melting like wax. Remember me when you come into this city and devote it to your God. This dude is just looking for a quick fix, a quick out. How do you know that? Because he didn't settle with the Israelites. He went and built his own city afterwards. He's doing his own thing. He doesn't give a rip about the God of Israel. He's like, I'll sell out all my people in Bethel if you'll promise me you'll let me go do my thing. And Israel's like, sure, sounds like a good trade. But that's not what God asked him to do. So little by little, man's intellect, man's reasoning, man's common sense, our great wisdom is coming up with all these ways to possess the land that God didn't tell him to possess the land. All these ways to deal with kings that God didn't tell him to deal with kings. All these ways to deal with the people in the cities and the plains and the mountains that God didn't say to negotiate. He said, devote them all to me. Now, this should start resonating with these little idols and these little ways that we say, I'm going to worship my God, but I'm also going to do my own thing. And God says, you can't do that. There's no such thing as worshiping me fully and devoting everything to me and then having this little thing on the side going, yeah, except for this over here, I'm going to do this little thing because I think my common sense is way better than God's grandiose plan for creation. But we do it. We do it a lot. And God says, I want to identify these things, your fighting practices in the spiritual realm, the way that you negotiate your dealings with people, because that's how you got to deal with people in my career field. God had done so much in the city of Bethel, at least they should have known the history of their people to know that we can just go right in because God has plans for Bethel. And yet they did it their own way. Verse 27. Manasseh did not drive the inhabitants out of Bethshan and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Elam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, and the Canaanites persisted to dwell in the land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. And so Manasseh followed suit and said, you know what? We're going to possess the cities, we're going to possess the villages, we're going to possess the land, but we're not going to completely drive all these people out because it's just too much work. And so we're going to let them live amongst us, kind of like the Jebusites in the tribe of Benjamin in Jerusalem. We heard it's not working out so bad. And they probably had this plan. When we reproduce and we multiply and we get big enough, or we rally all of our people, or we get everybody together and everybody gets settled in, when we exert power over the land, because God promised we're going to exert power, we'll just make them forced labor. We'll just put them to work. They can haul our water, they can clean up our donkey mess, they can do all the things that we don't want to do because we'll make them. Well, the rationale behind that is if you're big enough and strong enough to make somebody be forced labor, aren't you big enough to drive them out of the land? Yeah, but our kids don't want to do their chores, and so we're just going to have the Canaanites do what our kids don't want to do. It's not that big a deal, Jim. So verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun, they didn't drive out the inhabitants of Keton or the inhabitants of Nahalal, so the Canaanites lived among them, but they become subject to forced labor as well. Asher did not drive the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon or the Aklab or of Azik or of Helba or of Aflek or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. So up until this point, when they don't drive the people out, it says that the Canaanites lived amongst the Israelites, which is bad enough. But then there's a shift in this next verse. What verse is that? Verse 33. There's a shift that takes place because when we say it's okay for the world to infiltrate in and we adopt the practices of the world and it's not that big a deal and you're just being an alarmist and I don't know what the big deal is and I don't know why you're freaking out so bad about this and so why don't you just relax? It's not going to affect us. We're going to let them dwell amongst us. But in verse 33, the shift takes. And Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, so they lived among the Canaanites. You're like, oh, that's just a little twist. No, it's so huge. Because it moves from the Canaanites living among the Israelites to the Israelites coming in and going, would you mind if we moved in next door to you guys? Would that be okay with you guys? Can we just settle in this village over here? We won't cause a big scene. But our God promised us this village, and instead of dispossessing you guys and driving you all out, we're just going to live amongst you. Is that okay with you? And what do you think the people said? Live amongst us instead of devoting us to your Lord? Absolutely. Want us to build a house for you? Can we do anything to help? Do you need help getting your belongings moved in? Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath and all the inhabitants of the land welcomed them fully. And after they got settled in, they said, you know what? It's not completely okay that we just live amongst you. We're going to make you forced labor. Is that okay? And people are like, instead of devoting us to your God, sure. Where's the water? We'll start carrying it. They just kind of slid in, coexisted, and then when they got big enough, they made them forced labor. Is this a big deal? Yes. Verse 34, the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country. That's a dramatic shift. Up until this point, it's like, we're going to let them live amongst us, we're going to live amongst them, it's all going to be okay, we're going to coexist. And then the water to the face hits in verse 34, and the Amorites go on the offensive. And the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down into the plains. And the Amorites persisted in dwelling in the Mount of Heres, in Ayalon, in Sha'abim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Aqrabah, from Selah and upward. So not only did the Amorites dictate the land that they were going to hold firm, and they're like, you know what, you're not coming here, and not only that, we're pushing you back. They were deep and established. And then it's got to blow our minds of how, as deep and established as the Amorites are, that they submit to forced labor. That's only God, but that's not his perfect plan. So maybe Dan said, you know what, we're going to call all of our brothers together and we're going to destroy you guys unless you become forced labor, because the practice of our land now is we're not devoting to the Lord. Obviously, we're just going to make you forced labor. What say you? And the Amorites probably did the math and said, yeah, we'll do the forced labor thing. And Israel content with this new culture that they've decided to have to make them forced labor. And we flash back to Joshua's gathering all of Israel together. And what did he say? Choose you this day. What? Not who you're going to worship. Who are you going to serve? Which means, who are you going to live 100% for? According to his plan and his purpose and his promise. Who are you going to follow? And what did they say? Oh, we're in for God, right? That's a no-brainer answer. We're going to so do it God's way. And yet, not even a generation later, they've got all these different ways of dealing with their enemies that God told them not to deal with them. And they're strong enough to possess the land. But the question is, did they have so much fear? Or did they have so much doubt? Or were they just apathetic to God's commands? That caused them to get to a place where they're directly disobeying God's plan for the promised land according to what he had. And it's not like they hadn't been warned once or twice about coexisting with the Canaanites. Now, is God such a bad God that he doesn't want the Canaanites to live in their land? No. The Canaanites said, we hate God. They were enemies of God. They had every opportunity to call upon the name of the Lord and be saved, just like Rahab did. They all knew Israel. They all knew the works of God. They all had hearts melt like wax when they heard the testimonies and the works about our God. But they made a choice to become Israel's enemy and thus make themselves God's enemy. And God says, we can't have that. If they're not going to bow their knee to me, they need to go. Because if they don't bow their knee to me, they're going to bow their knee to something or someone. And I don't want my people around that. And so God repeatedly warned them over and over and over. When you go into the promised land, do not let those people stay. Drive them out. Deliver them into me. Let me deal with them. Because God knew Israel's heart, and God knew the Canaanites' hearts. And God knew the Canaanites were always going to worship their gods. And he knew that if Israel came in and coexisted with the Canaanites, guess what they were going to do? They were going to start saying, what are you doing over there? What are you worshiping? What is that to? Oh, Baal? Baal, oh my gosh, he's the god of fertility. And if we pray to Baal, our crops increase. It's awesome. All we have to do is sacrifice stupid things to him, and we get good crops. And our kids, oh my gosh, we were like barren until we offered special sacrifices to Baal, and then my wife had doublets, which is a Canaanite twin. And they started figuring out all these different things they could do to the altar of Baal to get blessed. And they started telling their friends, hey, you know what I found out today? There's an altar of Baal. If we go do crazy stuff, we get blessings from it. But that's not all. Baal's got a wife, Ashtoreth. And the cool thing is, it's not just like one Baal or one Ashtoreth. There's a lot of them. So we can do this wherever we want to. And we can actually build our own altars. God, he's mean. He makes us go to one altar. But we can build all these altars. And we can do whatever we want to. And we'll be blessed. See, it's not that bad that we had let these people live with us. It's actually going to work in our favor. We get God's blessing, and we'll get Baal's blessing. So messed up. And yet we still do the same thing today. We just don't call them Baals and Ashtoreths. Why is this such a big deal? Because a generation hadn't even gone by, and they're already making up their own rules. And they're letting these people live amongst them, and they're living amongst these people. And in their haphazard, justifiable way, oh, well, we've made them forced labor. Isn't that good enough? Well, not if you're going to worship their gods. But it wasn't an overnight thing. It was a gradual, slow decay, a slow decline. That the nation of Israel went from a nation of Israel possessing God's promised land and driving out all the inhabitants to tribe by tribe, making up their own little take on it and doing their own little thing regardless of where they went. If there was hills, we'll figure it out. If there's lowlands and plains and chariots, we'll figure it out. If there's cities and there's good hiding places, we'll figure it out. And they started coming to all these iterations of God's perfect plan for their lives until they find themselves now completely surrounded by the Canaanite people, their gods, and now you got Israel drifting to start worshiping the Baals and the Ashtoreths. And at some point, somebody probably looked up and said, what happened? What took place? How did we get here? And we're asking the same thing in America. What happened? When I was a kid, which now is longer than I want to choose to admit, things weren't like this. What happened? There's a phrase throughout Judges. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's where we find ourselves. And the thing is, we say if we allow people to do everything that's right in their own eyes, people are inherently good, and they're going to make good choices, and we're going to better improve our society and our civilization. And the history of that thesis or hypothesis, if you look at real history, has failed miserably. And yet we're still promoting it. The humanists say, we are God, and we are good, and we will create a better place. You just need to do it our way. And God says, you are broken. You've been broken since you were born, but I've made a way for you to be restored fully. Because I love you, and I sent my only son to die for you. And you are not the fix to your own problem. And we either choose to believe that, or we believe the lie that we can do this on our own and we will make it better than God could ever do it. And that's where the Israelites found themselves. We can do it better than God. Just watch. And they did, and we get to learn from it. Or we get to repeat their mistakes. So the vision for Church for the Beach for 2018, we have got to get into intimate relationships with one another outside of this gathering. I don't care what you call it. Call it coffee. Judges 2:10, a little flash ahead. I'm stealing Rich's thunder for next week. Sorry, dude. What was the effects of this doing everything right in the sight of your own eyes? Well, we're going to do it better than God could have done it. What's the effect of that on the next generation? It says in Judges 2:10 that all the generation were also gathered to the fathers. And so all of Joshua's cronies, all of his boys, all of that generation, they eventually died, right? Took a whole generation to die off. But all of the people that lived in Joshua's day, that saw all that God did through the promised land, conquering the land, taking the land by force, not completely occupying it yet, right? But taking possession of the promised land so that Joshua would say, I've done what I've been asked to do. I'm going to go be with God. All those people that experienced that, it says, moved on and were gathered to their fathers, which basically means they died. And there was another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done in Israel. So we asked the question, what's the big deal? Things are going okay. We're surviving. We've got crops. We've got family. Everything seems to be going. Like, we know God said not to do it this way, but it doesn't seem like it really broke anything. Why are you making such a big deal out of it? It doesn't seem like it did much when it happened. But the consequences in just one generation completely screamed that they shouldn't have done it that way. That the next generation after them did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel. They didn't know about God, they didn't know the character of God, and they didn't know all that God had done from beginning of Abram, much less from the deliverance of Egypt. They lost that whole account. How? Well, either they didn't listen to their moms and dads, or their moms and dads weren't sharing it, or a little bit of both. Because the next generation knows it all. Why do they need to listen? It's okay. I was there one time. But maybe their parents weren't saying it. They were like, oh, they don't listen to me. I'm just going to stop talking. God said, when you get into the land, I want you to remind your people annually who I am, what I've done. Read them the whole book of the law. Sit them down and say, I don't care if you listen or not, but you're going to get something out of this. And they read from Genesis all the way to the account of what God had done through Joshua. And then they told him what God's plan was for the promised land, his blessings, his entitlement, everything that he had promised them. God says, I want you to do that every year. Well, chances are they didn't do that. And so now we've got a whole generation that doesn't know God or know the works of God. They don't know the promises of God over Israel. And they still don't. So where are you going with this, Jim? The second thing that God gave us for Church of the Beach. Small groups was the first one. The second one is a subset of small groups. So really it's all one thing. Our children, our middle schoolers, our students, high school students. You can even throw the college kids in there if you want to, even though they know way more than we do. I love them. I was one of them. I get it. Our children, our middle schoolers, our high schoolers, God says, focus. Focus. We thought back and we're like, maybe it's the facilities. Maybe the school isn't conducive to kids learning about Jesus. And God says, what did I do in a sports bar? What did I do in a tiki bar? Like, oh my gosh. We could do it anywhere. God can do it anywhere. It has nothing to do with the where. It has to do with us getting back and saying, is this the most important thing? Because God said it's the most important thing for this season. You're like, oh, kids ministry is the most important thing in the whole world. You know what? If God says it is, then it is. And it might be for 6 months. It might be for 2 months. It might be for the whole year. I don't know. But if God said it to our leadership, hands down, then I think we should pay attention to it. We've got an awesome group of children's ministry people, peeps. We got awesome kids. I got to hang out with them last week. They're sweet. They're sponges. It's awesome. And we're going to celebrate those people today. We're going to appreciate them. We're going to love on them. We're hopefully going to encourage them. We're going to back up. Somebody says, we need to be reminded of the vision because we forget. I love that because I forget too. So we're just back and we're just going to spend 10 minutes of me just sharing, what is the vision for our children's ministry? Why do we even do what we do on Sunday mornings? What are we supposed to be doing during the week? What is this going to look like? But as I was praying over this and just like messed up over it, I confessed to the elders 3 weeks ago as we're in prayer, I just lost it. And I said, you know what, I'm so frustrated that it seems like we just keep hitting a brick wall in our children's ministry. So I'm just letting go. I'm just letting go. But in letting go, I spent more time in children's ministry preparation this week than I did on sermon prep. But that's okay because that's letting go. Does that make sense? I had to invest, but I let go. I had to invest in the message. I had to invest in our time this afternoon because I didn't want it to be a waste of time. So it's not like I just like, oh, children's ministry, whatever. God, do whatever you want to with it. No, I let it go. But then God says, okay, let's get serious about this. And as I've been praying about it, God said this one thing. And I don't even have a clue what it means. We're going to talk about it at the children's ministry meeting today. It's not up to an individual. It's not up to a group of people. It's not up to a team. It's up to our church family. So there you have it. The vision for 2018 as we see it now, because God spoke it in January or maybe November, small groups. Everybody participating in small groups. A subset of that is our children's small group, our middle school small group, our high school small group. And you may go, I didn't even know we had a middle school small group. We don't today, But we need one come August. When school starts, we need a high school small group because we have the capacity of the people to fill that group. We need that. And God says, okay, it's a church-wide thing. So I'm going to ask you, pray for small groups, pray for our children's ministry, because our children's ministry births middle school ministry. That's why we have a middle school next year, because we have a good children's ministry, and our high schoolers. And then, as you pray for them, say, and God, you said through Jim, he's either wrong or there's something to this. It's going to take all of us. What does that look like for me? And you say, do you want me to come to the meeting today? No, please don't do that. We love you, but we need to get a little bit of arms around this. And as things come up through the children's ministry or things come download to you, email me, email Marie. But just like God's promise and his plan for the Israelites in the promised land was to obey him fully, we got to circle back around and go, okay, where am I not being obedient to what God has instructed me to do? Or where did I take what God instructed me to do and then I put my little spin on it like, oh, well, God won't mind if I put my little signature scent on it, right? Yes, he does. And to circle back and go, okay, this step was God. This step, I put my spin on it. Let me go back to this step and start seeing what that looks like. Why is this important? So all this has been going on for like months. And when we walk through Joshua, I'm like, we know what the promised land is. We don't know how to get there. Now we're walking through Judges, and we're like, okay, let's learn the mistakes they made so we don't repeat those mistakes, because I don't want to be sitting here in December going, what happened? How did we get here? Because the cultural drift in society is just as prevalent as the cultural drift in church. Or let me back that around. We all recognize the cultural drift in society, but the cultural drift in church is just as prevalent as a cultural drift in society. It's easy for us to get off track. That's why God gives a vision. That's why God gives direction. That's why God circles back and says, you need to remind yourself and your people what the vision is. To connect people to Jesus, to build people up in Jesus, and to watch him transform lives. That's our vision. What does that look like for each one of the ministries we're a part of? We got to circle back. We got to spend time talking about that. But we drift as a church. And so the truth is we've drifted from our original vision. Our original vision was that everybody that was a part of Church Beach would be engaged in small groups. Guess what? We ain't there. Now, the cool thing about what happened then was Sunday mornings when we were so engaged in small groups wasn't really that cool. It wasn't the cool thing to do. I was just learning how to preach. I didn't know what I was doing. So I grabbed a stool, I grabbed a thing, and I grabbed a Bible, and I said, we're just going to walk through a scripture because I have no idea what I'm doing. It's okay. We're getting fed in our small group. We're getting encouraged in our small group. You do you. You figure out what God's doing. We're not going to miss a beat. We have Jesus. We have our small group. We've got the Bible. We've got the Holy Spirit. Don't worry about it. Now, is that a good selling point for a Sunday morning service? No, you know what? But that's the season we were in. Now, we have a pretty cool Sunday service. We got a pastor that makes up words on the fly. We got a praise team that sings to Jesus. We got keyboards and amps and drums, and I'm not discounting any of that. We have a good gathering on Sunday morning, but it can't be about the Sunday morning gathering. Because the better Sunday morning gets, guess what? We culturally drift to Sunday morning. And God could actually say, you've drifted too far, no more Sunday morning. What would we do? We would panic. We're going to lose our church. Nothing should change. Oh my gosh, I got to rabbit trail this. So we're doing double service, right? And we are walking through a service, and I praise teams up front, and I go to the praise team. I was like, you guys got to stop playing. And I got in front of our people, and I said, you know what? There's a code enforcement law that just got passed. The churches are not allowed to meet in public facilities any longer. We have to shut this down. And we had some cuss words fly. I was like, wow. We had panic. We thought this was what God called us to do. How can we not do that if we can't meet publicly on a Sunday morning? And I said, if you're panicking right now, you have good reason to panic because you're not engaged throughout the week in life and in small groups, and this is your church. And if God took away Sunday morning, you would know what to do. It was a good wake-up call. So let's do it again. If God took away our gathering at Ocean Breeze on 9:30 on Sunday morning, where would you be left relationally and spiritually today? And don't let that condition be the same condition as the end of this year. Make changes, make adjustments. Because that cultural shift shifts us right down to, as long as you make it on Sunday morning, you're good to go. And God goes, that should be the overflow of what I'm doing all week long. There's got to be something more. Yeah, there is. Let's figure out what that looks like with God, with our small groups, and with our children's ministry. Now, I use that example instead of a better one, but we're going to go with it. So it's easy for us to drift. Okay, I'll go with it. So I'm dealing with all this junk, and I'm trying to figure out what God's doing, and I'm reading through Judges, and I'm looking ahead, and I'm going, I want to preach like 3 chapters in a row, but Rich is preaching next week, so I can't do it all. And then Tuesday, I go to a luncheon with the South Brevard Ministers Association, and John Stemberger with the Florida Family Policy Council comes and he speaks. And he speaks about what? Cultural drift. And he's like, we all know the culture is drifting, but what about the churches? And he uses this great illustration that we can all relate to because we're beach people. But when you go to the beach and you jump in the water, and you're in that water about a half hour, and you come to get out, and you're like, where's my junk? Somebody stole my junk. I'm in Indian Harbor Beach. Nobody should steal junk in Indian Harbor Beach. We're like Mayberry. And then you're like, oh, wait. There it is. Way down the beach. Nobody stole my junk. I drifted. He said, Jesus is the anchor. He is the umbrella and beach chair. I won't say he's your junk. If we get our eyes off Jesus, guess what? We're going to drift. But the truth of the matter is, even if our eyes are on Jesus, we're still going to drift. We're broken. We're not in glory yet. Now, he's calling us every day to drift less and less, right? If we identify drift, guess what? It's no longer drift. If I know I'm moving, but my eyes are fixed on Jesus, I'm no longer drifting. I might be moving, but I might have to get out of the water for a little bit and go regroup, walk back to my spot. But if I identify it up front, guess what? It changes from unknowing drift to just being in this world, but not of this world. Because when I get to the work, my culture is going to look different from this morning. But praise God you guys get up and go to work every day because you're bringing non-drift to those places. Unless you're just settling in and saying, it's okay. I'll just coexist till 5 o'clock. I'll just let them live among me and I'll live among them. I know God said to be set apart and be different, but I'm going to do it my way. And God says, there's effects on you and the next generation if you choose to do that. So are we willing to rise up to that call? That call to stand firm and say, I know there's drifts, but I ain't drifting. I'm going to keep my eyes on Jesus. I'm going to let him do what only he can do in my life. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you that you are our anchor. God, you're so many different similes that we could spend all morning talking about those. But God, we're just going to say we thank you that you are our stronghold and our fortress, our security in times of trouble. And God, our culture is in trouble. Father, the Big C Church, in part, is in trouble. Father, our little Church for the Beach local family, we have areas where we say we don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. We could say we're in trouble. But God, in spite of all that, we want to celebrate the good. And so, Father, I pray today that as much need as there is in our children's ministry, as much as uncertainty as what you're doing, God, we know there's good because you have people that are dedicated and have been for years. We have children that are sponges that want to know more about Jesus. Father, we have a church family that loves our kids. Lord, nobody thinks of our kids as a nuisance. And Lord, our church family is blessed when our kids dance in the aisles. So God, we celebrate those things. We praise you for those things. And we pray that you would just continue to pour into our hearts the vision and the plan for this next generation, knowing that it starts today. Father, we pray for your vision for small groups. Lord, not a program. God, not some structured thing that we can plug everybody into so that we all feel good about being in a small group. Lord, that you design and you put on hearts and you relationally build according to your perfect plan. That's what we're asking for. And then, Father, we pray that you would just reveal to each one of us individually where we've drifted off. Where we said, I know God says this, but I think this isn't so bad. God, that today wouldn't just be a day of confession, agreeing with you. Today would be a day of repentance, saying, you know what, I just don't want that drift anymore in my life. I don't want that stronghold in my life. I don't want that to slow me down or entangle me, because the truth is that's what entangles me from getting close to other people, because I don't want that to be found out. And so God, today break free those things in our lives.